She had prepared herself on the road. She had told herself, quite deliberately, that a coaching inn 11 years ago was nothing. A cold night, a borrowed shawl, a parlor that smelled of tallow and damp wool. She told herself that the man she was about to encounter was a stranger to her, in all the ways that mattered. She had the whole of a 3-day journey from Bath to compose herself, and she had done an admirable job of it. She was still composed when the hired carriage turned through the gates of Thornfield Park. She was still composed when she gathered her skirts and descended into the pale November light. She was still composed when the housekeeper opened the great front door and Margot Ashmore crossed the threshold into the entrance hall, her valise following at the footman's hands. Richard Beaufort, Viscount Thornfield, was on the staircase. He stopped on the 3rd step down and did not move. He was 41 years old, and the years had altered his face in ways she had not anticipated. A gray thread at his temple, a line cut deeper at each corner of his mouth. He was dressed for the morning, plainly in dark blue, and his hands had gone still on the banister in the way the hands of a careful man go still when something unexpected has struck him. The housekeeper said something. The footman said something. Margot heard neither. She was looking at the 3rd step, and the 3rd step was looking at her, and the hall around them was warm and candlelit and full of the sounds of a country house preparing itself for a wedding. And she was 24 years old again in a coaching-inn parlor, listening for a knock at the door that never came. She inclined her head. A greeting, nothing more. He descended the remaining 3 steps and crossed to her with a steadiness she recognized because she herself had learned it. "Miss Ashmore," he said. His voice was low and level. "Welcome to Thornfield Park." "Thank you, my lord," she said. "My niece is very happy you have made me welcome." And she followed the housekeeper upstairs. She had been 24 when she met him. He had been 30, lately come into his viscountcy, managing an estate that the previous Lord Thornfield had left in considerable disorder. He was introduced to her at a dinner party at the Ashmore House in Somerset, where she had been keeping her widowed father company during what she had not yet understood would be his final autumn. Richard Beaufort had sat across from her and spoken about enclosure and the difficulty of reliable stewards, and she had argued with him mildly, from genuine interest. And he had looked at her with the expression of a man who had not expected to be interested and found himself unable to account for it. By December she understood that he was coming to see her and not her father. By January she had received a private letter that could not be mistaken for anything but what it was. Her father was not well enough for the formality of an approach. They agreed it would wait until spring. In the meantime they rode and met when they could. And one evening in the garden he had taken her ungloved hand and held it so carefully, it was as though he understood what he was holding. She had believed him absolutely. The winter had been cold enough that they could not always meet, and their letters had become a kind of second meeting, the pages worn at the fold from rereading. She had kept every one. She had read them on the nights she could not sleep, when the house was too quiet, and her father's breathing from the next room was too slow and careful. And she had found in the letters a version of herself she had not expected. She was a woman someone was writing to, as though she mattered, as though her opinions about enclosure and reform and the management of things were not simply tolerated, but genuinely considered. It was a particular kind of intoxication, that, being taken seriously by someone she admired, she had not understood then how rare it was or how carefully she ought to have held it. In April her father died. She was to go to her sister Dorothea in Wiltshire. Richard was to settle a final matter of business in London and then come to Dorothea's house to make his application formally. They were to travel from their separate starting points and rendezvous at the Oakhurst Coaching Inn on the Great Western Road, where she would pause for the night and he would arrive by evening. From there they would continue to Wiltshire together, the announcement following. She arrived at Oakhurst at 4 in the afternoon. She took the private parlor. She ordered tea and then supper, and then she sat beside the fire, while the inn went quiet around her and the clock on the mantel moved from 9 to 10 to 11, and at midnight she understood that he was not coming. She told herself through the midnight hour that there had been some delay, An axle broken, a horse gone lame, a road made impassable by the week's rain. She told herself through the 1 o'clock hour that he had been detained by the business in London, that the matter had been more complicated than anticipated, that he had sent a note that had not yet arrived. She told herself through the 2 o'clock that he was a careful man and a methodical one, and careful methodical men do not simply disappear, and therefore she had no cause for alarm. She held very still beside the fire and listened to the inn settle around her, its beams and boards contracting in the cold, and she told herself all the things that could explain a night without a knock at the door. By 3 o'clock she had stopped telling herself things. She waited until dawn to be certain. She was very thorough about it. Then she put on her traveling clothes and arranged for the next southbound coach, and did not weep until she was inside it and moving. With the inn's chimneys growing smaller in the window behind her, she never told Dorothea. She told no one. She said she had changed her mind about the match, and that Mr. Beaufort had agreed it would not suit, and that she preferred not to discuss it further. She was 24 and clever, and people accepted her composure as they usually did, without questioning what it cost. The right glove was in her traveling case still. She had noticed, 2 days after returning to Dorothea's house, that she had only one. She had left the other at the Oakhurst parlor, dropped when she gathered her things in the cold dawn, and she had not gone back for it. She kept the one that remained. She placed it in the lining pocket of her traveling case, and did not move it, and did not permit herself to think about why she did not move it. She was never quite sure why she kept it, though she suspected in the honest hours that she did know, and simply chose not to examine the knowledge directly. Cecily Haverstock was 18 years old and had her mother's dark hair and her deceased father's directness, and she loved her Aunt Margot, with a fidelity that Margot considered the best argument for the institution of the family. They had been close since Cecily was 7, when Margot had come to live in Dorothea's household as a companion, and had read to Cecily every evening from a copy of Cowper's poems until the girl fell asleep. Cecily had the kind of attachment that forms early and does not permit revision, and it was she, entirely, who had pressed her mother to invite Margot to the wedding. Dorothea had been uncertain. She said, as she said regularly in one form or another, that Margot was a woman of a certain age and a certain quietness, and that Lord Thornfield's family would expect the principal wedding party to consist of people with more animation. Cecily had said that Aunt Margot was coming, or I am not. And Dorothea had written the invitation. The house party assembled the following morning. There were the Croft family from the village, including Mr. Siston, Elias Croft, who served as the Thornfield solicitor, and his wife and daughter. There were 2 of Richard's school friends from his years at Oxford, now married and full of easy laughter. There was Lady Beaufort, Richard's mother, a small upright woman with gray eyes and the authority of someone accustomed to having her assessment of a room treated as final. There were Dorothea's 2 younger sons, Cecily's brothers, full of young men's noise and appetite. And there was Margot, who moved among them all with such natural warmth and such perfect propriety that it took her some effort each hour to remember where she actually was. On the second afternoon, she came upon Cecily in the small sitting room off the upstairs corridor, sitting with a letter in her lap and tears on her face. The letter was from a childhood friend who could not attend the wedding, and the absence had caught Cecily unprepared, in the specific way that small losses catch us when we are already silently afraid of larger ones. Margot sat beside her without ceremony, took the letter gently from Cecily's hands, read it over, and told her to write tonight. Tell her you will have her in June when the roads improve, and that you want her to see the walled garden before the roses go. Cecily put her head against Margot's shoulder. You always know exactly what to say. I've had many years of practice, Margot said, knowing what to say to you. She did not see, until she stood to leave, that Lord Thornfield was in the corridor. He was some 3 feet from the open doorway, and he had stopped there, and from the stillness in his face, she understood he had been there for some time. She could not know what he had seen. She could only see what she saw now, a man who had arranged his face into composure at some point in the recent past and was maintaining it through an effort she recognized, because she had made the same effort herself at intervals across 11 years. He was watching her the way a person watches something they have lost sight of and then unexpectedly found, and are not certain they have any right to look at. He said nothing. He did not enter the room. He looked at her for one slow moment, and then he turned and walked back down the corridor, and she listened to his footsteps until they disappeared. She stood in the sitting room doorway for another moment after that. Cecily was already at her writing desk, pulling a fresh sheet of paper toward her, with the sudden restored purposefulness of a girl who has been given something practical to do. She was chattering about the walled garden and the roses in it, and her voice had recovered its ordinary warmth, and she did not notice that her aunt was still standing at the threshold looking at the empty corridor. Margot went downstairs to change for dinner. That evening at dinner, Lady Beaufort held a brief private court at the far end of the table, where she sat with Dorothea and one of the Oxford wives, and their voices were low enough to be discreet and not low enough to be inaudible. "The aunt," Lady Beaufort said. "The one from Bath?" "Margot," Dorothea said. "My elder sister. She has been with us since our father died." "She seems pleasant enough," Lady Beaufort said, and the qualification in the phrase was as deliberate as a hem. "A woman of a certain age and no particular prospects, I assume. Was she never married?" "She chose not to be," Dorothea said quickly, as though the speed of the answer might forestall further inquiry. "Ah," said Lady Beaufort, and her tone contained a small amount of knowledge and a larger amount of conclusion. Margot at the other end of the table was cutting her portion of roasted pheasant with great attention. The following morning, Lady Beaufort made her observations more publicly. The ladies had gathered in the drawing-room after breakfast, and the conversation had turned, as it often did in such company, to the question of the season's more interesting marriages. Someone mentioned a young woman of Margot's approximate acquaintance, who had lately married a clergyman in Dorset. "Marriage at any age is a reasonable enough outcome," Lady Beaufort said, with the pleasantness of someone who believes entirely what she is saying, "though it is easier managed before one becomes, as it were, settled into one's ways. A woman of a certain age develops habits of mind that are charming in an aunt, and quite difficult in a wife." The room received this in the particular English silence that indicates general agreement with a specific discomfort about being seen to agree. Richard was standing at the fireplace with his coffee. He did not look at Margot. He looked into the fire. She was 35 years old, and she had managed 11 years of this kind of thing. And she did not flush or flinch. She said to the woman on her left something amiable about Dorset, and turned the conversation. She felt in her sternum the old and specific weight of having been in this room and in some version of this moment before, the room deciding she was something less than what she actually was, and the man at the center of the room electing not to say otherwise. The specific quality of that silence, when a person in authority renders a verdict on you, and the room consents without requiring proof, was a thing she had first learned at the Oakhurst Coaching Inn, and had refined her understanding of on many subsequent occasions. You learn to hear it clearly without reacting to it. You learn to put one thought in front of the next, and let the moment pass. What you did not learn, entirely, was not to feel it, and she had eventually decided that not feeling it was not the correct aim. The correct aim was to feel it fully and precisely, to know it for what it was, and to refuse its conclusion, with Mage and I. She had been refusing Lady Beaufort's conclusion for approximately 3 minutes now, and she was doing it very well. She rose and went into the garden with a shawl. He found her there the following morning. She was in the kitchen garden, between the last of the autumn cabbages and the bare herb beds, doing nothing in particular, which was to say she had come outside because the house had grown too small. She heard his step on the gravel path and knew it before she turned. "I would like to speak with you," he said. "You are speaking with me," she said. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the bare beds, and she could feel the effort it cost him to begin. When he spoke, the words came with the careful deliberateness of a man who has rehearsed them and found them insufficient anyway. He told her about the creditors. His father had borrowed extensively and badly, and by the spring of 1804 the estate had been so deeply encumbered that the only viable path to solvency was a marriage of fortune contracted within the season. He had known this before he set out, He had told himself he could manage both, settle the debt, honor his understanding with her, find some way. What he had not understood, until the creditors found him at Oakhurst and laid the figures before him, was that there was no way to manage both. There was only one path, and she was not on it. He had not written because he did not know what to write. He had not gone back, because the act of going back would have required him to look at what he had done. Margot listened. She let him finish. The garden was very quiet, and the November air was dry and cold, and carried the smell of turned soil and the last green things still clinging to the late-season cabbages, which smelled of earth and cold water and something determinedly living. She had imagined this conversation at intervals over 11 years. Not often. She had not been the kind of woman who spent her life rehearsing exchanges that would never happen, because that was a form of hope she could not afford. Occasionally, in the small hours of early mornings, she had found herself composing what she might say to him if she ever stood in a garden with him again and he told her why. What she had not anticipated was how ordinary the explanation would be. Not cold calculation, not cruelty, not indifference. A man in an impossible position who had chosen his estate over her and had then been unable to live easily with the choice. She had expected something that would help her be angry. Instead, she had been given something that only made her tired and sad and very certain that she was not 24 anymore and could not afford to be. She looked at his profile against the bare hedge and considered the shape of someone who had chosen wrong, the shape of someone who knew it, and the shape of someone who had spent 11 years building a life at enough of an angle to the knowledge that he could nearly not see it. She had some acquaintance with that particular architecture herself. "You might have written," she said. It was not forgiveness. It was not accusation. It was the single fact at the center of 11 years. Not that he had left exactly, but that he had left without a word, as though she were the kind of person it was acceptable to leave without a word, as though the absence of a note were merely practical and not a declaration about what she was worth. He did not answer. He had no answer. That was adequate. She walked back, inside. She did not look back and she did not weep. And she set the whole of the morning behind her and went upstairs to help Cecily try on her wedding bonnet. If you have ever sat beside a young woman and watched her rehearse the courage she does not quite have, you know the quality of that evening's silence. Cecily was very quiet through supper and quieter afterward. And at 9 o'clock, she came to Margot's room with her hair loose and her candle in her hand, and the look on her face of someone who has been holding something back for a very long time. She sat on the edge of Margot's bed. She said she was not afraid of marriage, precisely. She said she was not afraid of Lord Thornfield, who was kind and sensible and nothing she could object to. She said she did not know how to say what she was actually afraid of. And then she said it anyway. She was afraid of being married to a man she respected and did not love, and of the very long time that would involve, and of waking every morning, of that long time reaching for something she did not have and could not name. Margot sat beside her and looked at the candle flame. It was a very small candle, the kind you carried to bed, and the flame was steady in the still room. Outside the window the night was clear and cold, and from somewhere below came the distant sound of the last embers settling in the drawing-room grate. The house was very quiet, the quality of quiet that large houses have late at night when the servants have gone up, and the last guest has crossed the landing and only the inhabitants remain, the people who actually live inside the walls and know all their particular sounds. Cecily was 20 years between her and the girl beside her on the bed, and she felt each year of it with unusual clarity, sitting here in this room where a young woman was asking her, in the only way she knew how, whether what came next would hurt. Margot knew exactly what came next. She had spent 11 years assembling a life around the fact of having been left at 24 by someone she had trusted entirely, and she could tell Cecily with genuine accuracy what a long marriage to a man you did not love would feel like in 10 years and in 20. She could tell her about the accumulation of small accommodations, each one reasonable, each one individually tolerable, until you looked up one day and could not find the outlines of the person you had been before you began making them. She did not say any of this. It was not what Cecily needed to hear tonight. The question Cecily had not yet asked was the question Margot had been asking herself since she arrived at Thornfield Park. What did she owe her niece? What did Cecily's happiness require? She understood, sitting there with the candle between them and the house, silent around them, that her own silence was a shape of cowardice, not vengeance, not self-pity. Cowardice. The willingness to let something proceed, because stopping it would cost more than continuing. The threshold of the door moved. Dorothea stood there in her night things, holding her own candle, and wearing the expression of a woman who has interrupted something she finds inconvenient. "Cecily," she said, "do not trouble your aunt with this. She is a woman of a certain age with no experience of real marriage. Whatever anxieties you have on the eve of your wedding, she is not the person to advise you on them." Cecily looked at her mother. Then she looked at Margot. And Margot looked at her niece 18 years old, and asking without asking, and felt in her chest the weight of what she knew exactly what this costs. "I have been carrying the weight of it for 11 years. Good night, Mama," Cecily said. "I will come to bed soon." Dorothea lingered a moment, and then retreated. Cecily pressed Margot's hand. Margot said nothing yet, and they sat together until the candle burned low, and then Cecily went to bed. And Margot sat alone for a very long time in the dark, with the right-hand glove in her lap. The leather was soft and worn at the heel of the thumb, and there was a small mend at the forefinger seam where she had caught it on a rosebush some years ago. One glove held for 11 years, she was not even certain why. She went at dawn. The house was still. A single maid moved in the kitchen passage below, and the smell of the morning's first fire drifted upward. And Margot walked to the study at the end of the ground-floor corridor in the specific silence of early morning in a country house, when the world has not yet arranged itself and everything is still possible. She had been awake since before 4. She had sat at her window and watched the sky lighten by degrees, from black to gray, to the pale colorless clarity that precedes a cold November sunrise. And she had been, as she often was in the early mornings, very honest with herself about what she wanted. Not what was correct. Not what was wise. What she wanted. She had learned across 11 years of being alone that the early mornings were the time for that particular honesty, because the daylight hours required her to be sensible, and the night hours were unreliable, but the gray space between was clear and cold, and told the truth. What she wanted was a thing she was not prepared to name, even in the gray light. What she knew was what Cecily needed, and what Cecily needed was the same thing Margot had needed. Once, and had not been given the choice. She knocked once and opened the door. Richard was at his desk. He had not, she thought, slept. The fire had burned down and the room was cold, and he was in the same dark coat he had worn at supper, and there were papers on the desk that he did not appear to have been reading. He looked up at her. She did not preface what she had to say. She told him plainly that Cecily did not love him. She told him she did not mean this as a cruelty. It was simply the truth, and Cecily deserved to have it told to someone, by someone, before the morning was over. She said she understood the advantages of the match, and that she understood Dorothea had arranged it with the best of intentions for her daughter, and that she was not standing in this room to destroy a useful arrangement out of sentiment. She was standing in this room because a girl she loved was about to enter a marriage she had no genuine desire for, and the only person in the house with the authority to alter that was him. He was very still. "What do you want, Margot?" he said. "I want my niece to be happy," she said. "Is that all you want?" he said. She looked at him across the cold room and the burned-down fire and 11 years of managed silence. She did not answer. She left the chapel at Thornfield Park had stood since the reign of the second George, and was small enough that the assembled wedding party filled its pews completely. The morning was clear, which felt like a kind of irony. The light came in at the eastern windows in long pale bars that caught the dust in the air above the flowers, and the candles in the pressed faces of 30 guests arranged in their best mourning things. Margot stood in the second pew on the right, beside Mr. Croft and his wife. She was the bride's family. It was correct for her to stand there. She held her hands together in her lap and looked at the altar and did not allow her expression to tell anyone anything. Cicely came through the chapel door on her brother's arm, in cream silk and white gloves, and she was beautiful in the way that very young women are beautiful when they are frightened and trying not to show it. She walked the aisle with her head up and her eyes forward, and when her eyes met Margot's, they stayed there for one long moment, and something passed between them that required no words at all. Richard stood at the altar. The vicar opened his book. The morning light fell across the stone floor in silence. In the second pew, Margot held her hands together in her lap and kept her eyes on the altar cloth, and breathed steadily. She was good at breathing steadily. It was one of the skills 11 years had given her, along with the ability to keep her face arranged, while everything behind it was doing something quite different. She heard Cicely's careful tread on the flagstones at the chapel door, and she heard the small sounds of a congregation settling into attentive stillness, and she did not look at Richard at the altar, because there was no purpose in looking. The ceremony would proceed. Cicely would proceed. Margot would stand here in the second pew as family witness, which was precisely the correct place for her, and she would conduct herself with the perfect propriety she had maintained since the morning she arrived, which was the only thing she had to give that no one could take from her. She looked at her gloved hands. The right glove, the one that remained. The seam at the forefinger she had mended twice. And then he turned from the altar and walked back down the aisle. Not toward the door. Toward the second pew on the right. Toward Margot. She did not understand it at first. She watched him come with the flat incomprehension of someone who is seeing a thing they had not prepared for, who knows what they are seeing, and cannot yet believe it is happening in a chapel in Wiltshire on a Tuesday morning in November, with 30 people watching. He walked without hurry as he did most things, and his face was the face of a man who has stopped maintaining something at last, and the relief in it was so specific and so visible that she felt it in her own chest. The chapel held its breath. Dorothea's fan stilled. Lady Beaufort's chin lifted a precise fraction. The vicar looked up from his book and then looked down again, and Mr. Croft beside Margot made a sound that was not quite a word. Richard stopped in front of her. He looked at her with the expression of a man who has finally stopped managing something. "Miss Ashmore," he said, "I ask you to stand beside me." The chapel absorbed this in silence, so complete she could hear the candles. He turned to address the assembled company. His voice was steady and clear, and carried the quality of someone who has made a decision from which they do not intend to return. He said that Miss Haverstock was released from any obligation to him, with his complete gratitude for her patience and his sincere wish for her happiness. He said the engagement was dissolved by his request alone, and that any ill consequence of the dissolution was his to bear. He said that there was a prior understanding between himself and Miss Ashmore, contracted more than 11 years ago, and broken by an act of his own cowardice, and that, if she would permit him to honor it now, he would spend whatever remained of his life in making the delay worth her while. The chapel waited. Cicely, at the far end of the aisle, let out a breath that had been held since the previous evening. She pressed her gloved hands together. And then she smiled. The smile of a girl who has been afraid of something that has just been removed. And she looked at Margot, and her eyes said it plainly. "I knew. I always felt it." "Mr. Nin." Croft rose from his seat and moved to the altar with the solemn professional air of a solicitor who has been expecting to be useful and is gratified to have the opportunity. He confirmed in a few precise sentences that the dissolution was procedurally sound, that the arrangements had been made under terms that protected Miss Haverstock entirely, and that the register could reflect what circumstances required. Dorothea sat in the front pew and said nothing, her face undergoing a sequence of alterations that moved from fury to confusion, to something quieter and less comfortable, which was the recognition that she had arranged a match for her daughter with a man who was in love with someone else and had been for the whole of the acquaintance. And, That the match had accordingly been won, she should perhaps have examined more carefully at the outset. Lady Beaufort did not rise and did not speak. She looked at Margot Ashmore for a sustained moment, with the gray eyes of a woman reassessing an earlier conclusion. Then she nodded, once, with the formal precision of someone ceding a point. Margot was standing. She did not remember deciding to stand. She was simply on her feet in the second pew, with 30 faces arranged in a semicircle of attention, and Richard in front of her, and the pale morning light falling across the stones. "You kept me waiting a very long time, my lord," she said very quietly. "I know," he said. "You will not do so again." "No," he said, "I will not." The guests dispersed slowly, in the way that English guests disperse when they have been present at something unexpected and are not entirely certain whether they have witnessed a scandal or a vindication. By the time the last carriage had turned at the gate, the sensation had already shifted to the latter. Dorothea, in the small sitting room off the entrance hall, sat with a handkerchief pressed to her mouth for some time, and then collected herself in stages the way sensible women do. She said at last to Margot that she might have told her, and Margot told her she had not known what there was to tell. They sat together for a while after that, which was its own kind of resolution. Cecily came to Margot in the corridor and took both her hands. "Did you know?" she said. "When you came?" "I did not know what would happen," Margot said. "I only knew what I owed you." Cecily looked at her for a long time. "Escapes. Afraid of spending my whole life beside someone who was still somewhere else." She pressed Margot's hands. "I think you understand that." She understood it, precisely. Late in the afternoon, when the household had rearranged itself into a new and less ceremonial configuration, and most of the guests had departed, Margot found herself in the kitchen garden again. The same bare beds, the same cold air, the same gray stone wall at the far end, running with the last of the autumn moss. She stood among the cabbages in her best morning dress, which seemed now rather overdressed for a kitchen garden. And the afternoon light was thin and very clear. She heard his step on the gravel. She did not turn immediately. She waited until he was beside her, which took only a moment, because he did not make her wait this time. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and brought out something small and dark, and held it toward her. A glove. The left-hand glove, of the same soft leather as the one in her traveling case, somewhat aged, somewhat worn, the seam at the thumb frayed by time. He had kept it. He had carried it away from the Oakhurst coaching inn. She had not dropped it by accident. She understood. Looking at the deliberate worn quality of it, he had taken it, perhaps even as he was leaving, some act of taking what he could not stay for. She had thought, for 11 years, that she had simply lost it. The understanding that he had carried it rearranged something in her chest. She looked at it for a long time. Then she took it. She held both gloves together in her lap, the left and the right, together for the first time in 11 years, the leather of each a different shade from different weather and different use. They did not quite match any more. They were a pair, all the same. The afternoon light lay across the bare garden beds and the gray stone wall, and somewhere inside the house, someone had begun to play the pianoforte very softly, the notes falling through the upstairs windows into the cold, quiet air. It was nothing, she recognized. Something halting, something feeling its way back, like a piece of music, begun and put aside, and now resumed from wherever it was left. She did not look at him yet. She held the gloves together and let the music come through the window, and she thought about what a very long road it was between 24 and 35, and how she had walked every yard of it herself, and how it was perhaps not the worst thing to have done so. It had made her someone who could walk into a chapel and know her own mind. He said her name, her given name. He said it quietly. Margot. She looked at him. The afternoon was very still and very cold, and his face in the gray light was the face of someone who has stopped pretending, which is a kind of exhausting relief, she thought, for everyone involved. "You have a great deal to make up for," she said. "I do," he said. I am prepared to be thorough about it. She said that she should warn him she had been keeping her own accounts for 11 years, and they are very precise. Something moved in his face that might, in a different kind of story, have been called a smile. She put the gloves into her coat pocket, both of them, and she turned toward the house, and he fell into step beside her, across the gravel. The notes from the pianoforte found them as they came in from the garden, and followed them down the corridor, someone upstairs still playing, tentative and then more certain, the phrase, finding itself at last. That evening Cecily played them both, something she had been practicing for the wedding, which she now said she would play, simply because she wished to, and because there was no better occasion for music than an evening when things had come right, however unexpectedly. Dorothea sat in the corner chair with her handkerchief occasionally employed, and her face gradually settling into something that was not quite approval, but was considerably closer to it than she had managed all week. Lady Beaufort, who had not left as she had been expected to, sat very upright near the fire, and listened with the expression of a woman who has revised her conclusions and is not entirely displeased by what replaced them. Margot sat beside Richard on the small sofa near the window, and did not touch his hand because there would be time for that, and the propriety of the interval was its own kind of pleasure after so long a delay. She watched her niece play, and felt the steady warmth of the fire and the steadier warmth of what had come to pass, and she thought about the very long road from 24 to 35, and how she would not, if asked, have unmade any part of it, because it had made her someone who knew her own mind and the value of the choice she was making. The gloves were in her coat pocket, both of them together at last. If her story moved you, leave a thought in the comment below. It costs so little to say so, and it means a great deal. The music continued a while longer, carrying them all gently forward into whatever came next.